Thanks, Helen. Hi, everyone. I'm Julie Keegan with the New York State Special Education Task Force. I want to welcome you to our third in our 2025 series, our Lunch and Learn series, brought to you by the Special Education Task Force. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the task force, it was formed almost 20 years ago and has increased in popularity and has spread across the state. And a couple of years ago, we adopted this lunch and learn format as opposed to a annual conference to increase the accessibility for people to get this really valuable information. The task force is very unique in that it really is for all stakeholders, and that includes parents, school professionals, providers, and people with disabilities, so that everybody can kind of hear the same information and participate in a lively discussion, even though that discussion is facilitated. But the purpose of the task force is basically to just increase and improve outcomes and opportunities for students with disabilities. And I am so excited that we have Catherine McLaughlin with us here today from Elevate Us. Catherine has been on my radar for about 10 years now. Her work in this area of increasing knowledge and access to information about human sexuality for people with disabilities is so important and fills a gap that really just doesn't exist out there. So I'm really glad that we have so many participants today, and I know we'll have many more that see the recording afterwards, but we're really looking forward to getting this information because not only does it improve the quality of life for people with disabilities, but also protects them from abuse, in relation to sexual relationships. So I also wanted to let you know that later in the presentation, we'll be hearing briefly from Gemma White. She's a speech language pathologist who works at the Westchester Institute for Human Development and is working on making language more accessible around the issue of sex and sexuality. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine. And again, if you have questions, please use the question and answer in the chat. We will facilitate those questions at the end of the presentation. And with that, go ahead, Catherine.
All right. Thank you so much. So can you see my screen? Yes?
Yes.
Great. All right. I'm so glad you're all here, and I'm going to introduce myself a little bit more. I live in New Hampshire now, but I actually grew up in Ithaca, New York, so I'm a New Yorker, like many of you. I've been doing this work for over 30 years, and a couple of things happened early on in my career, and the first thing was developmental disability agencies, special educators started to reach out to me and say, we need some help around this topic. How do we address sexuality? And then also in my mid-20s, I experienced an accident and had a spinal cord injury and started using a wheelchair. So all of a sudden I was in this new group, this new club that I didn't really know that much about beforehand. So I think having a personal experience as well as professionals requesting help, it really kind of led me down this path of teaching people with disabilities about sexuality and healthy relationships. So that's a little bit more about me. And I have a small company called Elevate Us Training. And most of my work is primarily with people with intellectual disabilities, but also people with developmental disabilities as well. I've done a lot of work with self-advocates or people with disabilities that around this topic itself. I worked with Green Mountain Self-Advocates early on. When I developed material, I developed a curriculum. And as soon as I went to see them, they said, nothing about us without us. We want to be part of creating these materials, and we also want to be one of the teachers of these materials. So a couple of years ago, I had a grant with the Developmental Disability Council in New York State, and we trained self-advocate professional teams to lead sexuality classes as well. And I've had done a lot of other work in New York as well. So I'm going to show you actually one piece of some work that I was part of in New York State. And you may have seen these videos, but the Office of People with Developmental Disabilities, OPWDD, myself, or Elevatus, and SANI's, Self Advocates Association of New York State, and then the University of Minnesota's Institute on Community Integration, where did all the video work. But on the OPWDD website, there are 4 videos that we created, and they're part of an empowerment series. And the first one is Sexuality in People with Developmental Disabilities. The second one, and I'm going to show you 2 of them today. The second one is Sexual Self-Advocacy. The third is Sexual Feelings and Relationships. And the fourth is Consent. So you should check those out because they're great. They're not necessarily education, more like a public service announcement, but it certainly gives really empowering messages to people with disabilities around the topic of sexuality. So let me just make sure I turned on the sound and it's still on. Okay, good. So here we go.
Sexuality and People with Developmental Disabilities is part of an empowerment series for self-advocates.
Part of growing up is having new experiences in your life. They might be like a new job, school, or taking on more responsibilities at home. You may have new feelings and new relationships. Maybe you're thinking about who you are as a person and how you want to show the world who you are. Maybe you want to start dating, find a partner, to be in a romantic and/or sexual relationship, or learn more about your body and feel good about yourself.
This is about our sexuality.
Is sexuality part of your life?
Yes, it is. Sexuality is part of everyone's life. Everyone has a sexuality, even if they are not having sex. Having information about sexuality helps us understand ourselves and what we want in our relationships.
Many people with disabilities do not get education about sex and sexuality. This happens for many reasons. Sometimes others don't think people with disabilities are sexual people. But guess what? Everyone is a sexual person in their own way. We all need information because it helps us make choices. Let's change how we think about sexuality and people with disabilities.
Sexuality is part of life.
Whether you have a disability or not.
Everybody should know what it feels like to have a partner, have a relationship, or just live a normal sexual life.
People with disabilities can be very sexual. I mean, we have needs just like anyone else has needs.
We have the same sexual orientation and the same gender as neurotypical undisabled people. Some of us are gay, some of us are lesbian, some of us are heterosexual, some of us are pansexual, bisexual, etc. But some of us are also trans or non-binary. We are like everybody else in this universe.
Everybody should have the information.
I wish to have learned more about pleasing a person.
I wish somebody had told me straight up, your mom and dad might not be comfortable with things, but you can have the same life as anybody else. You can get married, you can have kids, you can do all those kinds of things despite your disability.
I wish that the school setting we were in taught us more about sexuality and just the normal, healthy relationships.
Sexuality and sexual feelings are normal. Some people have sexual feelings and some don't, and both are normal.
You have the right to ask for information. You can learn about sex and sexuality from classes, books, and people like a doctor, a nurse, a counselor, or a trusted friend.
Remember, it's okay to have questions about sex. It's okay to ask the people that support you for information. Being a sexual person is a part of being a human.
Sexuality and People with Developmental Disabilities is part of an empowerment series for self-advocates.
Just going to stop it there. So I have some handouts for all of you, some resource lists, and those links are all on the resource list as well if you want to have access to those. But as you heard, people with disabilities were saying, you know, we have the same feelings as other people, and we need this information just like everyone else does as well. Hold on, let me get going here. Here we go. The other thing is when I mentioned that I talked to Green Mountain Self-Advocates years ago about creating materials around sexuality education, I asked them, why do they want and need to learn about this? And they said, so we can learn to have healthy relationships. So we aren't lonely. And we know that loneliness can be an issue for people with disabilities where they feel really isolated and experience loneliness. So we are able to make informed choices. So not just make choices, but get information so that we can make choices that are right for us. So we can pick the right person. For the toughest part of the relationship, making it last. So we can be safe. And one self-advocate said, I learned from the school of hard knocks, and I'm still getting over the trauma of learning the hard way. Because we all have desires and needs, and that's okay, so that people can become sexual self-advocates and not just self-advocates. And a lot of self-advocates say that when they bring up wanting to learn about the topic or dating or having privacy in their room, people get really nervous and uncomfortable. And what they're asking us is to just have these conversations with them so that they can learn and be healthy and happy as well.
Catherine, would you mind making the slide full screen?
Yes, let me try to do that. Hold on one second. Yeah, that should work.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah. So we hear from self-advocates, we want and need this information. And then, so that's a really important reason to address this topic in whatever capacity you can. But also we know that the statistics are really high, and Julie mentioned that in the introduction as well. So people with IDD are 7 times more likely to be sexually abused than someone without a disability. And if we look at women with IDD, they're 12 times more likely to be sexually abused. So the statistics are staggering. And education, knowledge, and skills is protection. Knowledge and skills gives us power, and we're empowered to speak up when something doesn't feel right. So that's one of the statistics. And then the others, there's also been some data around sexually transmitted infections as well as unplanned pregnancy with this population. So higher rates than students without disabilities. And so we know that that lack of education can lead to some of these negative consequences. So we're going to talk about the reasons it's important, which I've already started to talk about. Self-advocates are asking us for this information. They want to learn about these things. And also the statistics are really high, and we want to impact those and bring those statistics down. We're also going to talk about what is accessible, inclusive sexuality education. What does that mean? What's effective sexuality education? We're also going to talk about some of the messages that you received around this topic of sexuality. And we're going to explore some myths and ways to dispel myths. And we're going to look at a bunch of resources. And that's where Gemma's going to talk about some of the work that she's doing. So we're going to talk about some resources for you as well. And, you know, basically we're going to go through this agenda, why it's important. We're going to talk about, well, what is sexuality, messages you received, and then we're going to talk about human sexual development. I'll do a short kind of mini lecture on that topic. Then we'll also look at, well, what are some of the barriers for you in addressing this topic with your own children, with students in your school, in your professional role. And then we'll look at some resources and tools. And I like to have a few group agreements when we're talking about a sensitive topic. So if people at the end bring up questions or you know, scenarios or different situations, that those stories stay here, the details of the story stays here, but what we learn from that can leave. Also, it's okay to just listen and absorb all this information. And also notice your assumptions too. If you think about addressing sexuality, are you thinking, are you making assumptions about those that you're supporting? Are you assuming that everyone is heterosexual, or that are you assuming that people with disabilities don't even want to be in relationships? Just sort of notice your assumptions as we talk for the next hour. Take space, make space. And that's for, people who are talkers, they might want to hold back a little bit and let others speak. But in general, please put your questions in the question and answer function. I'm going to pose some questions for you to participate a little bit as well. But otherwise, questions can go in there. And then don't yuck my yum. You may have heard that group agreement before. And it's really just about respecting differences of opinion and different decisions people have made regarding this topic as well. So I'd like to have just a few of these just to think about how we're going to interact in the next hour. But what I wanted to also do is define what is sexuality, because when we hear the word sexuality, we immediately think it means sex, right? We hear that word and that's what we think it means, but it's much broader than that. So when I'm talking about sexuality education, I'm not talking just sex education, I'm talking sexuality. And this is how I like to define it. So we all have a sexuality, and it said that in the video as well, right? We're sexual beings from birth to death. And that doesn't mean we're having sex. It means we have a sexuality. So everyone has a sexuality. And what that means is there's an aspect of your life that is related to intimacy, connection, belonging, feeling a part of things, feeling close to other people. That's an aspect of our sexuality. It's also about all the relationships that we're in and how we interact in those relationships. And it could be friendships, or it could be a sexual relationship, or a family member relationship, or a coworker, or with a helping professional. So there's lots of different types of relationships that we're in. Another aspect of our sexuality is how we feel about the gender that we were assigned when we were born, and our gender identity, as well as our sexual orientation. And it's about how we feel about others and ourselves as well. So do we have high self-esteem? Do we have high self-worth? Do we have a positive body image? That's another aspect of our sexuality. And then the last piece is sexual expression and sexual behavior, but it's not all of it, which is where we tend to go when we're looking at this topic. But it's a big part of who we are, what we believe, what we feel, and how we respond to things. So all of us have a sexuality, and it's unique to us. And we need everyone needs information in order to have healthy relationships in their life. So I'd like to just open up the chat for this next piece and just ask you all to, put your first name in, just to introduce yourself, and then write down what was the primary message that you received growing up about sexuality. What was the primary message you got about this topic of sexuality? So I'll give you just a minute to put those in the chat. And it could be a verbal message or a nonverbal message about this topic. Great, thank you all. So we've got it's private, not to be discussed, privacy, very positive, be who you are as long as you're happy, no discussion, not to be discussed, didn't talk about it, sure. I was always told sexuality was private. None from my family, not talked about, not a subject we talked about. It's something that's fine, but not something we talk about. Okay, yeah. And it was mixed. Some people had mixed messages, and the dangers, especially about diseases related to sex. So we do often get these fear-based messages as a culture. So in the Mean Girl movie, the phys ed teacher says, if you have sex, you will get chlamydia and you will die, right? Which is not true. But it was a way to scare people. And so we tend to get a lot of those messages around, this is a scary thing. Slightly uncomfortable, but open for discussion with my mother. The primary message I got about sexuality was that it was bad and not to be talked about. Yeah, so it looks like a lot mysterious. Men are men and women are women. Not something that kids need to know about. Yep. Yeah, so lots of we have to talk about it, but we never did. Hush, hush, hush. So lot you can hear there were a few positive messages sprinkled in there, but most of them were don't talk about it. That's not something that young people talk about, and or that it's a scary thing as well. And we can have lots of shameful feelings about the topic because of these messages that we have been given. Self-advocates, people with disabilities, have said here are some of the messages that they received or still receive. You're not a sexual being. You should not have sex. You can't have sex, probably don't even want to be in a sexual relationship. You're innocent and childlike and need protection from sexuality. You're not responsible. You can't solve your problems. You're unable to make good decisions about sexuality. You always make mistakes. Um, and that they would not make good parents, so should not have children is a strong message they receive. And they also notice that their non-disabled siblings get different messages than they get. You know, people say, well, my sister, my brother got this, this, and this, and nobody talked to me. So yes, many of you said, don't, you know, you got the message, don't talk about it. But people with disabilities get even more so about it, and are often thought of as not having a sexuality or needing this information. So I think the first thing we can do, whether we're a parent or a professional, is to be more positive about it and really think about why do we give such negative messages about this topic? It's a normal, natural part of life to be in sexual relationships. So why are we so negative and fear-based? And we were taught that. And so we have to unlearn those messages and start giving more positive messages. So sexual feelings and needs are healthy and normal. It's okay to have questions and be curious about this topic. It's your right to have a relationship if that's something you're interested in. It's okay to ask for what you need. Sex is a positive and pleasurable part of life. You have the right to be in a sexual relationship if that's something you want and you are a sexual person. Everyone is. So we want to start thinking about some of the messages that we give, and that we want to be more positive about this. And one of the messages I give too is it's your body and you get to decide what's right for you. So that bodily autonomy that many people with disabilities do not have or are never really taught that they get to decide who touches their body and who doesn't. So I'm going to talk about human sexual development and just give you kind of an overview of it as well. And then we'll talk about what's the same for someone with a disability versus someone without a disability. So humans, I'm going to do kind of an overview and then age groups as well. So the development of biological sex. So this is our genitals or our sexual parts. So that is the beginning of human sexual development, is how we develop. And then the second thing is we're born and we're babies and we look between the legs and we assign gender. And for many people that works out fine. We look and we see a penis and we go, oh, it's a boy. And that young child grows up and feels like a boy. But sometimes we don't get it right. And people grow up and say, I might have female parts, but I feel like a man. So we've assigned the wrong gender. But also, gender identity is something that young kids form early in their lives. So 3 or 4 years old, they start to form their gender identity and they say, I'm a boy or a girl. And possibly people feel like they might be non-binary or whatever. We don't usually talk to young children about that. So they usually identify as male and female. But then we also start teaching how to do gender. For example, when a baby's born, we buy pink purses and jewelry for girls and baseball bats and toolkits for boys, right? We start already teaching gender roles, gender expectations. So that's really gender starts early on in a young person's life. Then we also learn values and attitudes. So when I'm teaching people with disabilities about sexuality, they already have values. They come to my classes with values, and that's okay. And when I'm teaching, I am values neutral. As a parent, we can share our values about this topic, but as a professional, we want to be values neutral. Plus, everyone already has values. So I help people in my classes make decisions for themselves based on their own values, not my values. Then we move into the physical and emotional changes of puberty. So the body is changing from a child to an adult. And this is another area that we want to make sure young people know about, because it can be really upsetting if you don't know that your body's going to change and you start to menstruate, or you have a wet dream and you think you have cancer. It's more likely for students with disabilities not to know about body changes, and it really depends on the school. But as a parent, you could also talk to your school about, is my child getting this kind of information as well? And um, the other thing that happens during puberty is the development of one's sexual orientation. Now, we're born with our sexual orientation, our gender identity, our personalities, but it tends to unfold during puberty because now the body's changing and there's hormones going through the body, and it's having some physical effects on the body, as well as sexual feelings develop. So there's different areas of orientation, and they're not always the same, but in general, there's three areas. Who do we like? Who are our friends? Who do we like to do things with outside of school? Which is, who do we like? Who do we love? Who do we fall in love with? Who do we have this romantic attraction for? And then lastly, who do we lust, or who do we think is really good looking and we have a crush on them? So there's different aspects of our sexual orientation, but they're all our feelings of attraction. Who are we attracted to in these different ways? And then as young people develop, you start to experiment with that attraction, and you start to experiment with sexual behavior. You might start kissing or touching each other's bodies, or, as you develop, you're exploring these feelings of attraction through behaviors. And then you form your sexual identity. And so that is heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, pansexual, asexual. We're learning more and more from people who feel that they don't have erotic attraction to be sexual with another person. And it's not just a phase, it's more that they felt that their whole lives as well. So we're learning a lot about different kinds of identities. And then we're looking at a sexual knowledge and skills, and that's something that we do our whole lives. We're learning about, depending on where we are in our lives. Are we adults and now all of a sudden we have children and we're like, how does this impact my sexuality? And so we're always learning. We're not done at 18. We're learning our whole lives about this topic of sexuality. And then we'll look at young children. So we'll think about maybe 0 to 8. And so what we want to do is make sure that young children know the names for their sexual parts, the medical terms. It's okay to have slang words as long as they know the medical terms. And the reason this is so important is it normalizes, it's just a body part. We can use the term. It also gives people language if something negative happens. There was a day program that shared a story with me where a young woman kept saying, he keeps touching my purse, and they kept putting her bag in different places. And it took 3 weeks before they realized she was talking about a slang word for her vagina, which was her purse. It's really important that people have the language. If something negative happens, they can report it. And then lastly, I think it also, for young people with disabilities, they're seen as the perfect victim. They're taught to please and comply, and often don't have education about what's a healthy relationship or not. And so predators see them as the perfect victim. And I think if they use language, they appear less vulnerable. There's this feeling of, oh, they have information, and so I don't see them as the perfect victim. So we want to use medical terms for young children. Also, a common behavior in young children is genital touching. If you have a baby now in your life and you take their diaper off, their hands go right to their genitals, and that's a normal, typical behavior. And it's soothing. It's not erotic. It's a soothing, relaxing feeling for a young baby. Another typical behavior for young children is sex play. And what we really want to do is not react to these things because they're normal to be involved in sex play. And so we can have boundaries around different things like genital touching or sex play. We can say, when we play with our friends, we keep our clothes on. You can have boundaries around it. That's fine. But we don't want to overreact to it. So we want to know that it's normal and typical for young people, and that it is based on curiosity. It's not sexual in nature. We see it with our adult eyes and it looks sexual to us, but it's more about curiosity, exploration, imitation, play. Young children also want to know, about reproduction and how babies are made. And there is nothing wrong with telling young kids how babies are made. We've been taught not to do that. We've been taught, don't say anything, don't talk about this topic. And we sort of have this idea that if young kids know about reproduction, somehow we're shattering their innocence. And they're fine knowing about it. It will not harm them to know about reproduction. And what tends to happen is around 5, a young child might ask, how do I get out? How did I get out? So if it's a parent, they can tell their story about that. And then usually about a year later, they ask, wait a second, how did I get in there? And again, it will not shatter their innocence and will not harm them to know how babies are made. Then we've got roles of male and female, and many young people are kind of like the gender police, and they police each other around how they should be acting and behaving as males and females. And then also body image might be an issue for young children, depending on the messages they've gotten around their bodies and not eating too much and things like that. So they could have body image issues. And then the need for privacy increases for young children. But it's also taught very subtly. So we really need to teach young kids the difference between public and private places, behaviors, topics. So knowing that difference, so that we're able to do the things that are okay to do in public and not in private. In private, we have a separate list of behaviors. They're not bad, they're just private. So going to the bathroom or changing your clothes, those are private things. And there's nothing wrong with them. They're just things people do in private. Also, with this age group, we really want to teach bodily autonomy. And you've probably heard the example of if a Aunt Doris is leaving the house and a parent says, Amy, go give Aunt Doris a hug. And Amy says, I'm not comfortable with that. And then we say, do you want to hurt Aunt Doris's feelings? And what we're saying is, your feelings don't matter. Aunt Doris's matter more than yours. And we want to teach that if you're uncomfortable with something, it's okay to say no to an adult if you don't want to hug someone. So we want to say things like, Aunt Doris is leaving. How would you like to say goodbye to Aunt Doris? And they have control and choice around who touches their body. And they're not trying to just please other people around that. We also want to talk to young children about the different kinds of relationships we have with people and how we interact in those relationships, what kind of topics we talk about in those relationships. So for young children, there's a lot of this kind of foundational knowledge that's important. So you can start talking to a young child about sexuality. Then we're going to move into adolescence. And early adolescence would be more about puberty and how do you take care of your body, but also friendships, because sometimes around puberty age, friendships change and people don't, they kind of veer off into different thoughts and interests. And so learning about how to keep friends, make friends is an important skill for people with disabilities. Also, we want to talk about reproduction connected to puberty, so people understand why the body's changing, and that when you go through puberty, you are now your body can now make a baby. We want to talk about the different kinds of sexual expression, and this might be with older adolescents, and what is contraception and sexually transmitted infections, as well as what are sexual feelings? What is a crush? What does that mean? And what are your choices around sexual feelings? We want to talk about masturbation. It's a normal thing for people to touch their sexual parts. We want to make sure people know it has to be done in private. And then we also want to talk about sexual orientation and gender identity, because that's part of being in our culture, is we have lots of different orientations and gender identities. And so it's important to know that, so that you understand the culture and can be supportive of coworkers or friends or yourself as well. Body image may still be an issue for young people with disabilities, but a big thing that they really want to talk about is relationships. How do I make friends and keep friends? How do I get a partner or a significant other in my life? And they want to know more about that. They often know a little bit about biology, but they want to really learn about relationships too. How do we form them and keep them? And then also, how do we end relationships as well? So just briefly, I'm going to talk about what is the same for students with disabilities and what's different. I was going to pose this question, but I think I'll just go through the slides. I have a couple other questions to ask you. But as far as students with disabilities, what's the same? So much is the same. But first, they're assigned to gender, and gender roles are reinforced. So we do that to all young people. We teach them how to do gender. Biological changes are the same. Young people with disabilities go through puberty within the typical range of age that young people go through puberty. There are a couple of conditions that people have. Williams syndrome and Prader-Willi are two syndromes where the sexual organs may be delayed in developing, or they may not quite develop in the same way. But in general, biology is typical, is the same as anyone else. They need the same information based on the biological age. So if you have two 18-year-olds, one with a disability, one without, they need the same information. How you teach might be different based on one's cognitive abilities and limitations, but not necessarily what you teach. They have sexual feelings and needs just like others do. They have crushes, they want to be in relationships, and they have dreams about maybe someday getting married or maybe having children. So all of that is the same, and so much of it is the same. And then what's different is oftentimes how we view people with disabilities. So we think of them as not sexual people or oversexed. So they can't handle this information. So I'm going to withhold the information from them to control their oversexed self. And many self-advocates have said that they were taken out of the mainstream health class during the sexuality unit. They could learn about nutrition, but as soon as sexuality started, they were removed. So they often lack basic information about sexuality. Often considered children, and we accept behaviors rather than teaching for them to act their age. Like if you're a 17-year-old, you don't hold hands and skip into school with your mom. Like 17-year-olds don't do that. So we want to teach, like, as you grow up, you're going to act differently and do different things as well. And the nature of their disability might impact sexual development. They may not pick up on those social cues, or they might need additional topics. Like when I've done sexuality education for students without disabilities, I don't go into public and private. That's something they've learned subtly. But sometimes people with disabilities need more of that concrete explanation about public and private or types of relationships, and also may have trouble identifying emotions and reading body language. So we may have to do more around that as well. Lack friendship and social opportunities to practice social skills. If you don't have any friends, how are you going to get better at being a friend? And also, many of us learned from our friends about sexuality. It was that informal learning. Maybe it wasn't the most accurate, but we definitely learned things from friends. And students with disabilities don't even get that. So they don't oftentimes get sexuality education in schools. And sometimes parents are really worried about the topic. And all parents in this culture worry that if you talk about it, it'll give them ideas. And it doesn't. They already have ideas. It gives them knowledge and power and protection. Lack privacy to explore their sexuality, often don't have the opportunity to have privacy around this. And many parents said that they've let go, like when they heard their child had a disability, they kind of let go of that aspect of the child's life and thought, it's not going to happen. Or one parent told me they thought, well, I get a pass on this one. I don't have to talk about this. And then I'm telling parents to talk about it. So I'm sort of bringing it all back up again, and they've already grieved that as well. And then the other thing is parents are very worried about sexual abuse. They're worried their child will be abused, and they're worried their child will be the abuser. And so sexuality education is sexual abuse prevention. It's a piece of that. How you teach is different, so that's what's different. And, there's such a wide range of abilities and limitations. It can be hard to meet all the learning needs, but that's true for math and reading and things as well. So that can be a little more of a challenge, but in general, lots of things are the same, except for these ideas around difference. All right. So I'd like to open up the chat again and just ask you, we know that people with IDD often don't get sexuality education. I mentioned that they're often taken out of health class. What have you seen due to this lack of education? What are the consequences of this lack of education? What have you observed around students with disabilities who don't have any sexuality or relationship education? What have you seen? And I'll have you put your ideas in the chat and give you a minute. Yeah, lack of understanding of consent. What is consent? Accidental promiscuity. I have children with a lack of boundaries and age-appropriate behavior. Yes. Perseverance on the topic of sexuality. Misunderstanding among students trying to express their feelings and desires. Sure. They really want to, many students really want to date and have relationships, but aren't sure how to approach dating. Yeah. Unknown public expectations, their behavior becomes pathologized. Absolutely. We see it as this deviant behavior when it is typical behavior, but just happens to be in the wrong place. Inappropriate behavior and understanding what's going on around them. Pregnancy and birth of a child. Yep. They end up on a BSP. What does that stand for? Behavioral support plan, probably. They might be fixated on the topic. Yeah, so lots of consequences. And I showed you the sexual abuse rates and the unplanned pregnancy, high rates of dating abuse and sexual assault because they haven't been given any info on the signs and lack boundaries. Yes, exactly. Yes. Okay, great. Behavioral support plan. Yeah. So now they're kind of in trouble, or we were working on their behaviors as well. So yes, lack of education leads to these consequences, and education itself reduces the risk of these things happening. Great. So sexuality education, in order to be effective and inclusive, we want to be positive and not fear-based, right? Like I mentioned that already. We want to cover many topics, so it's comprehensive. It's not just abuse prevention, but it's also about how do you make friends? How do you keep friends? How do you get a partner? All of those aspects, not just abuse prevention. It empowers people and gives them information. It's also inclusive of all gender and sexual identities, so no one feels invisible in class. It helps people become sexually healthy and have positive relationships. and reduces the risk of these negative consequences that you all just listed. That's what effective sexuality education is. So one of the things that I have in my curriculum is this concept of sexual self-advocacy, and I mentioned it earlier in this presentation. But I'd like to share this video with you. It's another one of the OPWDD videos, but it talks about what does sexual self-advocacy mean to you, to people with disabilities. So let me show you that one.
Sexual self advocacy is part of an empowerment series for self advocates.
Have you heard the term self-advocate? Being a self-advocate means to speak up for what you want.
It means making your own decisions.
Asking for help when you need it or want it.
Being responsible for yourself and taking a big role in getting what you want in your own life.
Being a sexual self-advocate is about speaking up for what you want in your life, about how you dress, have relationships, and sexual experiences.
Sexual self-advocacy means to me to speak up about wanting the same things as other people that don't have a disability. We want to get married, we want to have kids, we're sexual beings. Just because we have a disability doesn't mean we don't think about it.
Being able to speak my mind and being able to say what I mean and mean what I say when it comes to sexuality.
Sexual self advocacy means if I'm with a significant other, that I want my privacy.
You can advocate for your body and your choice. You can say yes, you can say no. If you're not comfortable in a situation that you don't want to get yourself into, you always have the right to say no.
Being a sexual self-advocate is asking for support with relationships and sex when you need it.
It's telling your parents, friends, and support providers what you want.
It also means you get to have some privacy and can decide to not tell people personal things.
It is important to talk to people who you want to have a relationship with.
If you have a partner, it is letting them know what you want and asking what they want.
Being a sexual self-advocate can help keep you safe and help you feel better about yourself.
It can help you have the relationships you want. It can feel very empowering and help you feel happy. My body, my choice.
As a sexual self-advocate,
My body is my own. When something doesn't feel right, then it isn't right.
good information helps people make choices. I have the right to information that is true and given to me in a way I understand. If we don't have good information, we can't make choices that are right for us.
I can speak up for what I want. If we're afraid to tell someone what we want, we may never live the life we want, or we could get hurt along the way.
It can be hard to be a sexual self-advocate, but it's worth it.
Remember, you get to decide what is okay and not okay with you. It's important to tell others what you want.
All right, so if we're thinking about this term, sexual self-advocacy, I have another question for you in the chat. Is what barriers do you face in discussing sexuality with students with IDD or your own child with IDD? What barriers do you face? So if you could put those in the chat, then I'll know kind of what barriers people face. So what gets in the way or what makes it difficult? Knowing them and how they learn, yep. So if you don't know them and you're not sure how they learn, that can be a barrier. What are some other barriers for all of you? Like what stops you? Parents don't want us to talk to them because they think they won't understand or don't need to know. Yep. Prejudice. Being told it's inappropriate. And it can wait till they're an adult. Parents' varying levels of comfort with the topic. Yeah, sure. Agree with the parents not wanting their child to know. Yep. So they agree with their parents. Yeah. Finding developmentally appropriate materials and discuss age appropriate topics. Yep. Knowing what is best practice for students at varying levels. Sometimes students repeating info learned in the wrong context has caused barriers. Sure. Yeah. All of a sudden they're talking to everyone in school about it. And yep. Religion can be another layer of the conversation. Child has already been given the wrong information. Yep. Fear that education will lead to pregnancy. It was inappropriate. Yeah. So we certainly, there are many, many barriers. And, you can, as far as working with parents, I often talk to them about, well, what worries you about your child learning about this topic? And sometimes parents just need to see the curriculum and see what you're going to be teaching as well. And I always say to parents, if we don't teach healthy sexuality, something else or someone else is going to teach unhealthy sexuality. So if young people are going online to learn about sexuality, yeah, there might be some good stuff out there, but a lot of it is not. And so, or someone might abuse them, and that's how they're learning about sexuality. So don't we want to be part of these conversations? And especially parents, they can guide people with their values. And if you're teaching the topic, you're going to be values neutral, and you're going to accept all the values in the classroom. So there are lots of best practice methods around this as well. And please reach out to me if you have more questions about how to teach the topic too. And I do have materials and things. So lots of barriers, but let me give you a few tips, and then I'm going to show you some resources. So the first thing is we just want to give positive messages that it's okay to talk about this and learn about this. Lots of people are curious and need to learn about this topic. We also don't want to assume that everyone is heterosexual. So if you're in a school and you're talking to a young man, you don't want to say, do you want a girlfriend? Because you don't know. We want to just say, would you like to be in a relationship or a significant other? And so you're being inclusive. And then if he says, I want a girlfriend, then you can start using that language. So you don't want to assume. You don't have to know all the answers. We have put a lot of pressure on ourselves to know everything about this topic. There's some great resources I'm going to show you, and you can look things up as well. It's okay to feel embarrassed. None of us talk to us. We didn't have good role models around this. And as a culture, we don't talk about it, or we laugh about it and joke about it. So what does a normal, healthy conversation sound like? We don't have a lot of practice with that. It's okay to answer a question later. Maybe you have to look something up. Maybe you're in a public place and it's a private topic. It's okay to say, great question, but let's talk about that when we're in private. We want to give, as professionals, we want to give factual information, age-appropriate, medically accurate information. We don't want to share our values. That's the parent's job, to share values. We can share a range of values or opinions. We could say, some people think this, other people think this. What do you think, right? Because it's really about their values. We want to be very concrete and detailed, which I'm sure you all know. Use lots of repetition and use the media. Sometimes it's easier to learn about something over there versus your own relationship. So what did you think of the relationship in that movie? And what did you like about it? What did you think would make that relationship better? So you can use media as a teaching tool. And then just to kind of wrap things up, and I'm going to do a little bit on resources and then pass it to Gemma to talk about some work that she's doing. But just to wrap things up, the pros: reduces risk of abuse, being charged with a sex crime, loneliness, sexual behaviors at work, unplanned pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections, increases connection and healthy relationships. And it's really making a difference in the lives of people with IDD. And the cons to teaching sexuality education is we might be, us, the people teaching, might be a little uncomfortable or feel a little awkward, or people might get kind of upset with us for teaching this. But that's about us. And the impact of sexuality education, the pros are about the students. And that's who we're here to serve and work and support, as well as our own children. So as part of the handouts, you'll get a bunch of resource lists as well as a PDF of the slides. And I just I'm going to just show you quickly what those look like, and then I'm going to pass it to Gemma. So let me find those for you. Here we go. So the slides are in there. And then there is resources for professionals. And if you want to get on there's a resource page on our website, Elevatus, that has lots of tips and tools and things. You can also sign up for our e-newsletter. And then here are the videos that I showed you, 2 of the 4. There's that link. There's also Organization for Autism Research. There's a sex ed for self-advocates for age 15 and up. And then there's also some videos that were created by people with IDD for people with IDD. And then there's some puberty things and other resources there. So lots of great resources for you. And then the self-advocates, I just want to see if I put this one in here. I did. So let me make sure you all have this other one. I'm going to put the link in the chat, but there's one on, it came from a New York State, it's a Project Shine, Your Sexual Health Toolkit. And it's a website, and it was created by people with IDD for people with IDD. And here is the link to it. It wasn't on the resource list, but you can scroll down and there's different topics, and it's in plain language, and there's stories that self-advocates talk about around relationships. And then there's also a game you can play with people too. So those are some of the resources that I wanted to share with you. And then I'm going to just pass it to Gemma to talk about some of the work that she's doing. And then I'll wrap things up. Well, we'll open it up for questions in about 5 minutes or so, 10 minutes after I show you the resource.
Thank you so much for including me. This is so important. I feel like a lot of what I tend to speak about is mirrored in what you say, and I'm sitting there nodding. The focus of what I've been advocating for, and I've been affectionately known as the penis lady in the AAC world, is because when I started delving into this topic, a lot of the private parts were not in these symbol-based vocabularies. And you saw somebody in one of those videos using an augmentative and alternative communication system. Not everybody has access to literacy. And so I've really advocated with the companies to ensure that going forward, those systems will have the body parts in there. With that said, if anybody downloaded it prior to me yelling about this for the last 3 years, they will not have those vocabulary in there. And so what I try to speak about is really is on the onus of people who are supporting AAC users to ensure that the vocabulary and language related to private parts, related to private, safe, all sorts of that language is actually in the AAC systems for you to be able to utilize. And then the other part is that all of the people, we speak about abuse. We know that people who are known to the abuser, to the child, are more likely to be the abusers. Like when I grew up, it was like this scary person wearing a trench coat that would come round you and offer candy. Nope, that is not it. So we need to ensure that all of the people in the user's life are in the system so that they know safe people, that we have trusted adults who we can go to and talk about these topics, and that there are everybody who they're exposed to is there. So we can say that, Johnny made me feel uncomfortable when they were changing me in the bathroom. And to have those questions with your users, because we are often dealing with people who have complex motor issues, who are being handled by individuals far older than we would expect your typical 2-year-old to be physically handled and supported and wiped and changed, and that they have the language to be able to support themselves through those activities. So that's really what I talk about in a nutshell. Thank you for including me in this important topic, and I am also here as a resource.
Thank you, Gemma, and thank you, Catherine. Catherine, is there anything more you want to add before we move forward?
No, I think we could do the questions, and then I have just a few slides to wrap up as well.
Okay. I have to tell you, we haven't received that many questions. I
Okay.
don't know if it's because people are, are bashful about it, but folks, please use the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it like listed, then just choose that little circle on the right-hand side with 3 dots. And if you click on that, you'll see questions and answers. So if you do have questions, please share them and forward them now. I have a question that I think others might be interested in. If we're in the school context and we want our children to learn more about their sexuality, and they're in a special class, let's say, so 811, 611, something like that. What would you suggest would be a way that a parent could address that? Or even a teacher who's interested in bringing that into the school that has to, deal with administrators or parental objection?
Yeah. So at Elevatus, we have a 3-day training that people can attend, and you learn how to lead sexuality education classes that could be in the school or in a community. Also, how do you lead parent workshops for parents on how to talk to their own children about sexuality? And then how do you lead staff training? So if you wanted to train other staff in the school system around how do you address sexuality one-on-one with students with disabilities. And so that's a training that we offer that people might be interested in coming to learn, like, how do you get buy-in from parents and other professionals? How do you teach? What are best practices around teaching? Like I mentioned some around not sharing your values when you're teaching. So you become a sexuality educator and trainer. We also, the curriculum itself is 22 lessons and ranges from public and private to sexual acts and sexually transmitted infections. So there's 22 lessons. We have also adapted it for people with high support learning needs as well. So more graphic, more visuals, more time to process information. So there's other tools that might be helpful. I mean, I think training and tools are really helpful, especially if you haven't had any training around this before. So that's what I would suggest. Too, we also have, in relation to what Gemma was talking about, for the sexuality education curriculum, we have communication boards and cards as well for students who are non-speaking. They may not have an AAC device, but they use boards and cards, and we created those to go along with each lesson as well. So I think a lot of my work has been, how do I support other people in being able to address this topic? And that's through training and tools as well. And then as a parent, I would find out, what are the general ed students receiving around sexuality education? What are the topics that are covered? And then talk to the special ed teacher or whoever your contact is around, you would like your child to receive the same, if not more, than the children without disabilities in the school, that they have a right to receive that information. And you might have to get buy-in from administration around it. But I think schools really listen to parents when they have a need for their child. And if they bring it up as, I think this is important, I want my child to get this, I know what can happen with due to a lack of education. And so I think there's a couple different ways. Whether you're a teacher, you could get training and bring it into the school, find out what the policy is, all of those pieces. And as a parent, you can find out what's happening in the school and advocate for the need for your child to receive sexuality education as well.
That is so helpful. And I'm going to say it again. The nature of this work is so important. And I'm going to take off my special education task force hat now and put on my Disability Rights New York advocate hat right now. One of the things that Disability Rights New York does is investigate and monitor allegations of abuse and neglect. And we know that people with intellectual disabilities in particular are, and we discussed this, but I mean, I'm stressing it, are so much more vulnerable. And we have found ourselves, if we go into group homes or other locations to talk about like a know your rights kind of thing, a lot of individuals have never really been taught what abuse or neglect is, period, physical, verbal, sexual, whatever. And without having an understanding of what those things are, it is nearly impossible then to recognize that something is happening or have the language or tools to express it. And I know it's uncomfortable for parents. I get it. I know it's uncomfortable for school professionals, and I get it, but the need for it is so important. And you have made it like accessible. And I think that's incredible. The other thing I will say as an advocate is I think there would be a good argument to be made that if other general ed students have access to sex ed training, that it would be discriminatory not to offer that same training to a student with a disability. And so that is another angle, to be talking about, not necessarily a threat and I'm not saying it in that context, but to say, look, we need to do this. And just like we modify curriculum in other types of curriculum for students with disabilities, there is a way to do that when we're talking about sex. So I really appreciate this information. And I think it's very valuable. And I love that you shared resources, because that was the other thing I was going to be asking about is, what resources are out there. But you obviously have a ton on your website, and I appreciate the ones that you've shared. So I think that's great. And Gemma, I don't know if you want to talk about how, what the end goal is for you and sharing the information that or the resources that you're talking about.
One of the things is that you actually mentioned, Kathy, is that not everybody has access to an AAC system. So over my last 25 years of practice, what I've seen is that AAC systems are now fundable for people who are minimally verbal. Whereas prior to that, it was much hard. Even 10 years ago, it was very hard to write a funding report for an AAC system that would allow somebody to communicate. So if you refer people to a speech and language therapist who is an AAC specialist, and actually the specialty certification is coming out through the American Speech and Hearing Association, so it will be easier to find those through our organizations. You can, through Medicaid, fully fund an augmentative communication system for somebody to have support for that language piece. So within, OPWDD, alerting all of the staff that this is, you go to your MD, they can just write a prescription for you to come see a speech therapist who will then evaluate you and have AAC systems available to help with all of that advocacy.
That's great.
Super awesome to know about. So we appreciate that too. I am not. Oh, there's a lot of questions now. Helen, have you been?
Yes, I've been looking through them, and some of them were answered in your initial answer, but one that I think is a good one is, how do we approach parents about educating their children on this? I'm assuming that is from an educator.
Yeah. Well, I think taking a lot of this data and talking about even things that Julie said and Gemma said around, it's not a stranger that jumps out of the bushes. It's oftentimes people very close to the person. I think it's something like over 90% of people with disabilities who are abused know their abuser. So it's a high number, and many people with disabilities think that it's the stranger. There's a lot of stranger danger. We've taught that. When actually it could be someone really close to you. So I think parents are worried about sexual abuse. So I think making the connection between sexuality education as sexual abuse prevention is important when we're talking to parents. And I mentioned a little bit earlier, I often ask, like, what worries you about your child learning this? Because you want to find out what the resistance is from. And it's usually things like, it'll give them ideas. Someone else is going to share their values, and you can say, actually, no, we're values neutral as the educator. We just give information. It's your job as a parent to share values. Sometimes parents think it's all about sex, and it's not. And you can show the curriculum as well of what topics you would cover. And some schools will do, they'll offer, 8 weeks or whatever it might be, or 8 classes. And sometimes parents don't want their kids to attend certain ones, and they could do that if you're willing to be that flexible. I think that's hard to keep track of everything, but that is what some schools are doing. They're saying, okay, here are the 8 classes. Are you okay with all these or just certain ones? And then they remove the child during certain classes. At least they're getting something. So I think that's important. I just often will say to parents, knowledge is power, knowledge is protection. It does, ignorance is not bliss. The other thing is self-advocates say that if somebody restricts and controls them, they will work around that person. So sometimes I get it. Like, I want to sometimes control my daughter, right? I want to, lock her in a closet, right? It just like I want to protect her, right? And so there's that feeling of wanting to control. But as I've learned with my daughter is she's her own person, and she will work around me. And she doesn't have a disability. I'm just saying, sort of as a parent, we sometimes want to control, but we can't. And so if we try to control, people with disabilities say they work around people. And they say they are more risky when they're working around people. And they say if something bad happens, they don't feel like they can go back to that person and tell them what happened because they weren't supposed to do that. They were told not to. And so restricting and controlling can really backfire. Where don't we want to be part of these conversations where we can guide our children and we can give them our values? And so, even, and sometimes parents really, I want to say some parents would love for their child to receive sexuality education. Actually, most would. So it's usually a few, a vocal minority, and they could choose to opt out of the class, but you would still be providing this class to many students as well. So I think those are ways that I would suggest working with parents and really making that connection to sexual abuse prevention for them. So I hope
Thanks,
that helps.
Catherine. That was super helpful. And again, like that, the idea of building communication and trust around this issue, like I think that is what parents want. Again, even though it's uncomfortable, having your child talk to you about it is so much better, than information they might get elsewhere. So I really love that. We had another question.
Yeah, I wanted to also show a resource for parents that might be really helpful too. So there is a resource guide for parents, but if you scroll down, this is Disability Inclusive Sexual Health Network, and it was created, it's resources for parents. So if you click on that link, it takes you to this website, and you can scroll down. There's lots of different materials in here for you to look over. But what I really like is if you scroll down, there are these different fact sheets, and they're simple, and you just go, okay, body rights and body knowledge. So it's a 2-page, tips for talking to your kids about this topic. And a parent could just say, all right, I'm going to do, I'm going to do one of these a week, and then go back and get a different one the next week. So there's just some really good tools out there for parents to talk to their own children as well. Okay, I'm giving it back to you, Julie. Are there more questions?
Awesome. Great. So one of the questions here, and I know that you do consulting for service providers who provide community-based services for adults, including group homes, but other services. So this question says, many of our young adults living in OPWGD group homes are being deemed sexually non-consenting. And this is based on a very informal process facilitated by a group home provider and their care coordinator. So what are the recommendations for supporting young adults with questions and curiosity related to sexuality when they are, quote, non-consenting?
Yeah. So as part of OPWDD, there's a whole ADM. I'm not sure what that stands for, memorandum, something, and it says that we need to support people with disabilities around sexual expression and relationships. So if someone is deemed non-consenting, that the person that has deemed them non-consenting needs to give them sexuality education so that they can become consenting. And so if people are being denied that, they're saying, no, you can't do this. That person can say, I want to become consenting. I'd like to learn about this. And they are supposed to provide that according to OPWDD. So they may not have the resources or the skills or whatever, but they're supposed to help someone, if they want to become consenting through education. So I'm not sure if that specifically answered the full question, but
I think so. A lot of these other questions, I think that you have really addressed. And by sharing that resource page on your website, I think, because there's a lot of questions here about curriculums and age-appropriate conversations and materials for different age groups. So I'm going to really refer everyone to Catherine's website. Maybe we can put that link in the chat to talk about it. So let me just scroll down here.
Yeah.
Like, is there a training our health teachers can attend? Yes, there's a training. Catherine provides a 3-week or a 3-day, sorry, not 3 weeks, 3-day training and materials. So there's lots and lots of information out there. And I would encourage you to look at her website and the wide range of services and materials. This says more of a comment regarding the nonverbal or minimally verbal student and giving a means of enabling those students a way to express questions or feelings. That's very helpful. That's the comment.
Yeah.
What do you do when male students start touching themselves at school and they cannot understand appropriate and not appropriate, as urges and body changes are new to them and they have started trying to touch other students? And you want all the students to feel the same and comfortable and to understand. Just telling a student no touching others or self doesn't really solve the problem.
No. So I think the first thing that we want to do is, stop the behavior, right? Of course, like redirect whatever techniques you have. But we want to also analyze, why is this happening? Because when we just say no, like the person wrote, there's still a need, there's still a reason that he's touching himself or touching other people, right? So figuring out, what is this behavior telling you? Now, you might be able to say, can you tell me why you're doing that? And they tell you. They might say it itches, or they might say, I want a girlfriend, or I want a partner, whatever. So maybe they can articulate it, but sometimes they can't. They don't know why they're doing something, or they can't articulate it. And so then you have to come up with your best guess. Like, what are the reasons this is happening? And maybe the person that asked that, what is your gut? Like, why is this happening? Do they not know the difference between public and private? Do you have to teach that concept? Is that why? So what is your gut around why this is happening? And if you could put that in the question and answer part, we could then talk about, well, then what we want to do is, if it's public and private, then we're going to teach that. If it's a medical issue, then we're going to get the medical care. Is it, they've never been taught how to court someone? How do you get to know people? If somebody is going through puberty and all of a sudden they have these feelings, they might just act on those feelings versus knowing that you can't just act on your sexual feelings. You can't just go up to someone and touch them. So what are ways you can get to know people? So finding out what's the meaning behind the behavior. And what you find is if you have the right meaning, like say it's public and private, you teach that, the behavior goes away. But if you approach it, but public and private, and behavior doesn't go away, you've got the wrong meaning. And so what we tend to do with people with disabilities is we say, no, 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 not here. Well, where? Where can that, because there's clearly a need. And if it's to have a partner, how do you meet people? So we often just say no to a need, but the need is still there.
Right.
There was a young man at a school that used to put his hand down his pants every time he took the bus home from school. And the teachers got him a bunch of different really soft fabrics that he would put in his backpack, and he'd get on the bus and he'd take one out and he would hold it in his hand just to soothe. He was anxious being on the bus. So figuring out why the behavior is happening and then making an approach. And if it doesn't work, it's probably not the right meaning, and trying something else. So that might be helpful.
I think that's great. That's actually what a functional behavior assessment is, I mean, at its core. We're figuring out when any behavior happens, what is the communication that's happening there? What is the student trying to tell us, and kind of looking into it so we can figure it out. And if we're wrong, then we need to look to elsewhere. So that there's a lot of research to support that approach.
Right.
This is a little bit different than what I posed earlier. As an educator, what should you do if your district does not offer sex ed for your students because they are too severe for the curriculum, and the district's resolution is to hand you, the teacher, some books and say, figure it out? What can you as a teacher say to the district? I want my students to have someone that is qualified to properly teach this. Especially most of my students are boys, so I cannot fully understand, what they're experiencing.
Yeah, yeah. So I think one thing is to get yourself trained. And when I first started doing this work, I'd read a lot about boys because I didn't have that lived experience. So that's a piece you can also do. There may be like a local agency that could come in and do some sexuality education in the class as well. So that would be another option. I mean, I just think the more people can get trained, then you can continue to work with students year after year after year. And so you're reaching more people. We do have the high support learning needs curriculum as well. So there is some adaptations that have been made that might be helpful too. So you could also look at the materials. We have samples on the website to see like, would this work with my students or not? So I think, trying to get yourself trained, getting yourself the resources, pushing back on here's some books and figure it out. Like that's, like you said, you want someone qualified. It could be you or someone else. But also you need the tools. They don't tell you to do that with math or reading, I'm assuming. So why this? So I think that's how I would try to get buy-in for the support you need.
Okay. And again, just putting on my Disability Rights New York hat as opposed to my Special Education Task Force hat, I would also say that if the teachers who are teaching sex ed and health are receiving special training or have special qualifications, then the students receiving this information are also entitled to have teachers with special certifications and qualifications or special knowledge, and not just coming from a book. Students with disabilities should have access to the same type of training, or professionals with appropriate training. And that's really appropriate, as well as those students having the right to have sex ed training, if their general ed peers are receiving that as well.
Yeah, can I just say something as well? Because I think that there's one subtle difference when you're dealing with the population who need a lot of repetition You do need the support from those professionals with your curriculum, but you also need to make a concerted effort as a teacher to adopt the language, and to not shy away from using the language every time you send that child to the bathroom. Is your penis away? Tuck your penis away. And so small moments, teaching this in small moments repeatedly is more effective than one class.
Absolutely. So sort of using the teachable moments kind of format there.
Correct.
Yeah.
And with that, I have to run. I'm so sorry to pop off, but
Gemma,
thank
thank you
so much for having me.
You
we
bet.
really appreciate it. We do just have a couple minutes left, so I just want to make sure that everyone does complete our survey, our evaluation of this. Again, we read them; they're important to us, and we offer these for free. And all we ask in return is that you complete those evaluations so that we can continue to offer things that are of interest to everyone. I do want to thank both Catherine and Gemma for sharing the information they did today, and in such a practical, easy to way to understand, and all of the resources that you've shared as well. This is a super important topic, and it's great to see the number of people that have participated today. We're at the last minute, so I'm not going to ask any more questions. I mean, one of them is, do you run into any kind of legal barriers about what's covered in a training, especially I think in the current political climate, but I think that might be a little too much to get into right now.
Yeah. I mean, I agree that right now is not the easiest environment to be addressing this topic, but reach out to me. On the slides that you will have gotten, I believe, there is my email address too. So let me just show you. There's a QR code if you want to join our email list. And then here's my email right here on the slides. So reach out to me and we can talk about that. We're also going to do a workshop June 17th. So if you want to get on our email distribution list, we'll send you information about that. But it's romantic relationships and AAC users. And it's a young man who uses an AAC device with a disability who's going to be leading the workshop too. So reach out if you have any questions, looking for a resource or anything. I'm available through email really easily. I respond pretty quickly.
That's great. Thank you for being so generous with your time and resources and information.